Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome. And Francis, thank you so much for being here. I'll get my chair kicked around a little bit here. Francis, I'd like to just dive in and ask you, right out of the gate, what do you consider the most important message that we need to hear about your insights related to the world of social media?
So one of the questions I often get asked is, what things didn't land, right? Like, a lot of people have heard about the impacts on like teenage mental health in the United States, but they haven't necessarily heard about the whole breadth of what was in the disclosures. And the most important concepts that were in there, and I think haven't really landed, is first, Facebook is the internet for at least 1 billion users of the internet today. And those people live in societies that make up 3 or 4 billion people. Facebook went into countries voluntarily and said, hey, if you use our products, your data is free. If you use anything on the open web, you're going to pay for it yourself. And what ended up happening was 30 or 40% of the internet users in those countries only used Facebook. So it was all they could afford. And the internet converged onto this closed, privately owned platform instead of an open internet. And that has serious, serious consequences because unlike, say, hosting a newspaper site, these countries are instead becoming dependent on huge mega groups, like 5 million person Facebook groups, where the information in those groups is not, vetted by an editor. It's not prioritized by people. It's prioritized by algorithms that have biases. Mark Zuckerberg himself in 2018 said, engagement-based ranking, that's the process of saying this content is better than this content because someone clicked on it, because it got reshared, because it got a fight in the comment threads. That process is dangerous because people are drawn to engage with extreme content. We have already seen 2 mass casualty events in Myanmar, which has now been considered a genocide by the UN. The UN said specifically Facebook drove that event, and a second one in Ethiopia. Facebook has told us the only thing that can keep us safe is content moderation, that we have to choose between safety and freedom of speech. But the reality is, and I brought out 20,000 pages of documents to show this, they knew lots and lots of ways to design for safety. Like instead of slapping on content moderation at the end, they could have made the products much safer to start with. We can talk about that today. The reason why this is important is when we focus on language, we leave behind that billion people. We leave behind the people who don't have an alternative because Facebook has become the internet in their countries. And we are going to see more waves of violence in the future if we don't act. So that's like my most important message. I know it's a lot.
I asked a heavy question. I got a heavy answer. Right? What do you think is happening around social platforms, and corporate accountability that most people aren't necessarily aware of? So sort of expounding upon what you were just talking about.
That's a great question. So one of our major focuses with the nonprofit that we are founding right now is on investors and on litigators. So most people don't realize that we aren't kept safe just because the government passes a law or makes a magical regulator. We are kept safe because there is an ecosystem of accountability. So professors are part of that, academia. Litigators are with things like class action lawsuits. So tobacco, for example, was never regulated by the FDA. It happened through class action litigation. Investors, both ESG, who invest intentionally with social goals, or even just traditional investors. We've done a lot of conversations with very large mutual funds and very large pension funds because Facebook's value has fallen by over 50% since the first article in my disclosures. And they now understand they have huge liabilities on their books that they don't understand. And so what's different about social platforms than say cars. So Facebook always likes to say, cars kill people too. We're not gonna get rid of cars just because there's some side effects. But with things like cars, we can buy a car and crash it. And we did. People like Ralph Nader went and crashed a lot of cars before we got laws saying we had to have seatbelts. We can put sensors on those cars, and we have. Like Volkswagen lied for years and had a huge fine, billions of dollars of fine, because they lied about how their products operated. And when we put sensors on them, we said, hey, this isn't true. But when it comes to social media, everything that happens, all the important decisions happen behind our screens. We each only get to assess what social media is from what we see ourselves. And if you leave with only one message today, I want you to leave with the Facebook that you guys see or the Instagram you guys see is different than what everyone else in the world gets, because Facebook invests so much of its safety budget in English because they know they're an American company. Like, we're the ones that could act and force them to change.
Very interesting. Yeah, there's, of course, business side to social media, as well as obviously the consumer benefits that consumers have on social media. But there's some dichotomies there that are very interesting. So, for example, there's a lot going on now with thinking about data privacy, but
Totally.
also consumers are, hyper interested in personalization, right? So there's a dichotomy that exists. Or to your point about having content that's aggregated around what you're expressing your interest as being, and then in a bubble from that versus having broader exposure. So I'm curious from your standpoint, what advice would you have to companies, about how they operate on social media in light of all these social dichotomies that exist?
Totally. So the personalization conversation, I think, is a really, really interesting one. So I've spent most of my career working on algorithmic products. So I worked at Google on search quality for a long time. I was the lead ranking product manager at Pinterest on the home feed and related pins. And then later I ended up at Facebook. You're totally right. People love personalization, right? They love ranked feeds. Like, the reason why they're sticky is because they've experimented on you enough that they figure out how to make it sticky, right? But one of the things I think people are beginning to realize is there is short-term returns and there's long-term returns. And one of the things that these companies are really struggling with, and there's documents in my disclosures that talk about this. If you want to only be guided by metrics, you will over-index on short-term profits. So one of the documents talks about what's the difference between WhatsApp's culture, Instagram's culture, and Facebook's culture from a product development perspective. And Facebook Blue had a culture that the only thing that mattered was, did the metrics go up? And when you are trying to guide a company, guide an organization with just metrics, you often end up over-optimizing for short-term profits. So one of the things that Facebook has seen is that they have experiments called an integrity holdout. So 1% of you walk around seeing kind of a more chaotic version of Facebook. It's like Facebook without safety features. And they study people and they're like, oh, interesting. If you have that worse experience, people retain less. They use it less 6 months down the line. What the document said about the cultures was WhatsApp, because they couldn't see what was happening on the platform, they had to think a lot more. They had to have conversations about, like, if we do it this way, what do you think people will do? How will people respond? That is an important part of leadership. Perspective, insight, consensus building, that's important. We don't just need an algorithm to manage us, we need people to manage us. And one of the things we talk to investors a lot about is, if investors don't understand how to coach companies towards long-term profitability, let's put it this way. I think if Facebook was closer to Facebook of 2008, more of you would use it, right? Facebook of 2008 was about your family and your friends. It wasn't about flame wars as much. And there's real evidence in the documents about the changes that Facebook made that caused that greater amount of toxicity there. And it's all because of short-term optimization.
That's excellent. I think about this as I mentioned to you, having a course that I teach in social media marketing, but it's from the marketing and business angle. And I've actually had conversations with my wife about how I feel about that because of these insights around social and the addictive natures of it. And there's a lot of brain science that shows, these addictive patterns, these unhealthy patterns. People debate about whether or not there are correlations to the mental health with the release of or advent of social media. But I think there seems to be a fair amount of evidence worth investigating. I'm curious what you think that we as universities and faculty in universities should be doing with regard to being good leaders and educators to the next generation around social media.
So I think a thing that's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. So Facebook knew that if they hid all the interesting details behind the screen, we would never get to weigh in or have a conversation about how should these social platforms be structured. And I'll give you examples of, like, little tiny things that have very different impacts. So a lot of people feel very strongly about content moderation, and that's totally reasonable. Let's imagine Alice writes something, Bob reshares it, so her friend, lands in Carol's newsfeed, friend to friend. Carol reshares it, lands in Dan's newsfeed. Dan does not know Alice, 2 hops away. Alice doesn't know Dan. Dan doesn't know if Alice is a Russian troll. He doesn't know if she's an expert. He doesn't know anything about her. Imagine if Dan can still say anything he wants. He can copy and paste that post. If he thinks it's so important, he can copy and paste it and share it onwards. We're not going to, it could be conspiracy theory, it could be violent, it could be whatever. He has to make that choice, but he has to choose. He can't just hit reshare. Adding that pause, adding that moment of intentionality has the same impact on misinformation that the entire third-party fact-checking program does. So Facebook spends tens of millions of dollars a year having journalists go through and check viral news stories and say, is this true, is this false? That little design choice has the same impact on misinformation, only no one gets to choose, is this true or false? We just put intentionality in the process. Facebook doesn't want you to weigh in on, should we do that? Or should we do third-party fact checking? Because a world where you have a little bit of a pause when things get beyond friends of friends, and you say, hey, you have to choose to share this now. That world makes them a little bit less money. It's not even a ton less money. It's like a fraction of a percentage point because there's a little bit less content moving around the system. And so the thing that we need to be doing is thinking about how do we educate. So how many of you took a journalism class when you were in junior high or high school? Did any of you? Anyone take journalism? So think about this. Do junior high journalism programs make very good newspapers? Like, no. I mean, they make very wonderful ones. They have a lot of character. They're not great journalism, but because they made those, they made better ones. Or at a minimum, because you took journalism, you appreciate the practice of journalism in a democracy. Your generation is going to play a huge role in figuring out what is the social contract with regard to social platforms. Because there's a lot of different variations we could have, and we have never got a chance to weigh in on those until now.
So this is interesting. What you're talking about is, everyone who's involved around social media. And so that question was, of course, designed from the perspective of universities and faculty. But then there's those of us that are users, right? What should we, as just more broadly speaking, citizens, be aware of, or what kind of actions do you feel like we should be taking around social? That's very broad, but I welcome your insights there.
So I do think we need to have a much broader conversation about how these platforms work. Harvard is going to start publishing a large fraction of the documents just openly in the very near future. And I hope that people start making YouTube videos about them, start doing more awareness raising, because we do need to have a broader inter-educational process take place, right? Like we have to bootstrap hundreds of thousands of people to have opinions on these things if we want to actually have a democratic process around how these things are designed. I think on a much more basic level, one of the idea, like my favorite soapbox idea right now. So like I kind of view these meetings like stand up. Like every single time I say slightly different things. I see like what connects. I see what I like talking about, that kind of thing. My current thing I love talking about, and I would love to talk to you guys about, is how would social media look different if we designed for autonomy and dignity? So what does autonomy mean, right? Like autonomy is like, you respect my ability to make choices, right? Or dignity, you respect me as having value as a person, right? Right now, how many of you have turned on those like go to bed reminders on like Instagram or YouTube, right? It pops up, it's like, do you want to go to bed? So what do you guys do when the do you want to go to bed pops up? Anyone want to admit? Okay, we hit snooze. Come on. Let's be honest here.
Ignore it.
You ignore it. Right? Yeah. So let's imagine instead. So that's a superficial way of showing respect for me, right? They know you just hit snooze, right? Because they hit snooze. Let's be honest here. But imagine you did slightly different things. So you have a kid, right? So I always like to say, well, we can look to China to see what kinds of conversations we need to be having about social media. I don't think their solutions are the right ones, but they've moved a lot faster to talk about problems. One of the things they've done, and I don't support this, is they've said, if you're under 18, social media turns off at 10 p.m. You need to go to bed, right? It's an authoritarian intervention. I strongly believe, and the psychologists back me up, 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. is not the same as 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. So let's imagine you stay up late doom scrolling, and I will admit I am a doom scroller sometimes. You're up doom scrolling, and let's say the next morning you're in class at like 10 and you feel horrible and you've got like an Instagram hangover. let's imagine a little thing popped up and said, hey, when do you want to go to bed tonight? And you're like, I don't know, 11. I want to go to bed at 11. So let's imagine for 2 hours before 11, Instagram got imperceptibly slower. It's like every 10 minutes, it's a little bit slower. It's like a little bit slower. You don't even notice it. It's getting a little bit slower so slowly. And we've known for 20 years, maybe 25 years, that if you make a website even a tiny bit slower, we're talking 20 or 30 milliseconds slower, you use it less. And around 11, when you said you wanted to go to bed, you're like, oh, I kind of want to go to bed. That would be designing to respect your autonomy, your ability to make choices, and your dignity. And here's where it gets crazy. Designing for autonomy and dignity actually changes a lot of side effect things. So the Atlantic did a really beautiful article called Facebook's Super User Supremacy Problem. So all these systems, so one of the big things I'm working on right now is building a simulated social network for teaching classes. And part of the reason we're doing that is the dynamics of these systems are not the kind of patterns that you and I naturally think in. So humans naturally think in linear patterns. So like if I throw a ball into this audience, most of you are going to be able to track and be like, oh, it's going to be about there when it lands. And we think in normal distributions, or like that's kind of the area it's going to land. We don't think in power laws. So a power law is, a thing that goes like that, right? Like expands upwards. The 99th percentile on Facebook does not look at twice as much as the median. It looks at 100 times as much as the median. So let's say I look at 20 or 30 posts a day. The 99th percentile looks at 2,000 or 3,000 posts a day. And when you go look at what comments they leave, they're all really angry comments. They're all caps. They're shadowing people. They put lots of angry faces and likes and reshares all over stuff. And that influences what all of us see. So the fact that 1% can't go to bed or 5% go to bed means all of us see more misinformation. Right? So these little things where right now we can't have a conversation about how should we design social platforms because there's hundreds of people in the world who understand this physics because it was hidden behind your screens. And so the biggest thing you can push for, like as a simple thing, is saying, please respect me. Please value me as a person. Please value my ability to make choices and show me, don't tell me, show me you do this. Because those little abilities to give you back control have huge, huge cascading effects on other things.
I recently shared with students an Amazon study that it indicated that in their study, 1,000th of a second made a difference in consumer behavior.
That's crazy.
In terms of page load time.
Yeah.
Right. So we're become apparently
Milliseconds.
super hypersensitive, to that. I'm going to push on that issue a little bit because I'm probably I turned 50 this year. So I think I'm officially the old curmudgeon, now. Right. And so I look back on my life. I think I try to project that onto students sometimes. I would suggest that the collective, we understand that being on our mobile phones, specifically on social, for as the data shows, 3 to 4 hours a day. And I ask students in my class informally about this, and they validate that.
Yeah.
They probably recognize that's not the best utilization, of time, especially when 90+% of that is entertainment.
Yeah.
So, to me, this boils down to self-discipline. Right. I'm curious what your take is on it, though, about how, once again, we as a society, like, where do we have to finally grow up or mature up, regardless of age, and go, that's enough?
Yeah. So I think at a minimum, I'm a strong proponent of rate limiters, right? Because it's one of these things where they've done a huge number of studies now where, when you're scrolling on social media, like you're on Instagram and you actually are dissociating. Like they'll do things like insert really random stuff into people's feeds in experimental conditions, and people don't even notice because like part of what you're doing is just not being present. And so I think there's a real thing of people need to be aware that your software is persuasive. That's like the phrase. It is trying to convince you to do something, which is continue to scroll. And one way of taking back control before we start getting these actual like intentionality around respecting you is installing rate limiters on your phone and setting a budget for yourself is a real thing. It's a way of saying like, I'm taking control back from these platforms.
Yes, we have to recognize what those risks are, right? And make that connective tissue there. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about, and if you would share with the audience a little bit about what you're doing with Beyond the Screen, please.
Oh, totally. So we are focusing on capacity building and that idea that we are missing an ecosystem of accountability. So if we're going to talk about cars again, every point along the way, as cars became more complicated, became more present, we got to run along next side the auto industry and develop our own public muscle of accountability. And that's not just the government. Like I said, it's litigators, it's academics who understand, who can give us new frameworks of thinking about these problems. It's investors who guide these companies to be long-term successful. It's the public having opinions and putting market pressure on things. And right now, because that context, like the stuff we talked about today, has been hidden, you haven't gotten a chance to build that public muscle. And so we're doing two main projects. So the first is under an umbrella called duty of care. So if you make a car and you don't put a seatbelt in it, and you're going to save maybe $100, your car's going to have a little bit better profit margin. But if someone gets in an accident and they die, you're going to get sued because you cut a corner to make more money and there were consequences. You're going to be held liable. When it comes to social platforms, we don't have consensus yet on what the duty of care should be. Every single physical product, even the chair you're sitting in, we have societal expectations on how much they should have tried to keep you safe. Right? I guarantee these chairs are flame retardant, covered in flame retardant or something, just to make sure that the auditorium doesn't go up in flames. Because we didn't know there were choices being made or what those choices were or what the significance of them was, we didn't get to weigh in. So duty of care is around articulating problems. It's about expanding the conversation because I think we've pigeonholed on certain things and that keeps us from having a broader conversation. So we want to first articulate harms. So there's a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt who's done a really good job of, in an open way, gathering research and saying, let's articulate all the evidence we have on both sides around harm to children. And actually aggregating in one place has helped them to see that there's like certain danger windows. It's like ages 10 to 13, when kids go through puberty, is actually like a specific danger window. And then we want to say, okay, what are levers for influencing those problems? And then we want to say, hey, we often get stuck when we have these conversations where we pigeonhole too quickly on certain strategies for pulling those levers. So I'll give you a concrete example. Online bullying is a major problem, right? When you look at kids who commit suicide as a result of social media, a huge fraction of them have a substantial component around online bullying. And it's because when I was in high school, if you got bullied, it ended at 3 p.m. You could leave the school, you could go home. Likely you had an okay home life. You could talk to your mom, you could talk to your dad, you go, pout in your room if you really needed to. Now the bullying follows kids until they go to bed. It's the first thing they see when they wake up in the morning. One strategy for reducing effects of bullying might be to keep under 13-year-olds off the platforms. Right now, because the people who understand social problems don't understand technology, or often don't, they often always go to, let's verify IDs. Like in China, they do this. You have to associate a driver's license with your card, or you have to some kind of hard ID with your account. I'm against this. I think it doesn't work, and there's a bunch of problems with it. But if you asked a technologist, how do we find under 13-year-olds? They'd be like, oh, there's probably 10 or 15 ways to find under 13-year-olds. We don't need IDs. Guess what? A lot of fourth graders say, I'm a fourth grader at XYZ elementary school in their profiles, right? It's not like it's rocket science. We have geolocation on a lot of these phones. If you show up at an elementary school or junior high every day and you don't have very many adults for friends, like maybe you're a junior high student. There's a lot of these things where if you could know there was a menu of 15 options, you could actually have a conversation about what should be the expectation. And we've never gone to have that discussion because Facebook knew if they hid everything behind our screens, we had to trust them on how to approach the problem. And they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on telling us the only thing to discuss was censorship. Like they founded an oversight board. They've endowed it now with like something like $250,000, right? They did $125 million the first time, did another $100 million recently. The only thing the oversight board has jurisdiction on is content moderation decisions. They don't get to discuss things even like what languages do you support? Or like, can we see your efficacy rates for your content moderation systems? They can't even ask those questions. They've asked them and haven't gotten data. And they did this because Facebook knew if we couldn't talk about, here's the menu, this is what's reasonable, they could do whatever they wanted. So that's duty of care. We're going to do this public mapping we'd love for you to help. You want to write a final paper or midterm on like, hey, here's a way of finding an under 13-year-old. Here's a way we could deal with drug cartels. Let's break that discussion down into discrete elements so it stops being this amorphous thing. That's duty of care. And then our second thing is around simulated social networks. So how many of you have taken a data science class? Anyone? The way we teach data science is pretty reductive, right? We get these little toy problems where they're like, hey, can you figure out the answer to this riddle, basically? If you go into industry and you work on an industrial machine learning problem, or even like if you go into academia and you work on a big machine learning problem, when you try to decide, do we ship this change, there'll be 20 or 30 stakeholders. It won't have there will not be one answer. If there's 20, 30 stakeholders, some are going to win and some are going to lose every single time. And yet you're going to still have to decide, do you ship? 40% at least, maybe 50% of your job as a data scientist is going to be communication and negotiation. And likely you haven't been exposed to that much of it in your data science classes. So we want to build a simulated social network that has little agent-based models. It's going to be very messy, huge data set. And then we can teach classes where we talk about those conflicts. Imagine if we asked, should you have to click on a link to reshare it? It sounds obvious. It's like 15% less misinformation. And you don't have to censor anyone. It's just like a little bit of friction in there. Yet Twitter did it and Facebook didn't. So there must be something more there. Imagine if you could play the ads team and you're the new user team and you're the kids team and you're the non-English language users team. You're the growth team. And you all get to get in a room and defend, should we ship? Should you have to click on a link? That's actually what you do in your day-to-day jobs. And so we think there's these really fun, interesting ways of teaching that don't exist today, where we could actually begin having that larger consensus building process of what should the social contract be about social media. Those are our two projects.
That's great. Thank you. You started us off with a great overarching message. So I'm going to ask you a catch-all one before we turn things over to Q&A. Social media is complex. Humans are complex. Business is complex. I want to kind of ask you selfishly a question about, do you think that these social media companies are just massively driven by greed? But I think I can read between the lines. What overarching other thoughts do you have for us that we haven't already spoken about that's really important for us to take away today?
I think this is particularly in an academic environment. I think one of the most important messages I can leave you with is, if we were going to look at Tesla can make amazing cars because they have world-class chemists, they have world-class material scientists, they have world-class mechanical engineers, they have world-class roboticists. They didn't train any of those people in-house. They hired PhDs from Georgia Tech. They hired people with master's degrees. Sure, they did some in-house training, but they didn't start from scratch. And right now, every person in the world who does the job that I did was trained in-house, right? You can't take a single class right now in anywhere in the world on the physics of social media. Like the thing I talked about earlier about like, can we get that 1% to go to bed? What would the consequences of that be? Or like, where should there be friction in sharing? Where should we give people pause to think? And what would be the consequences of different choices? You can't take that class. And the thing that I'm super scared about, and I think like the recent Twitter whistleblower disclosures, plus, which is what I saw at Facebook, is when we depend on there being critical mass at these companies to develop that knowledge to keep us safe, it means there are not enough people in industry. Like I would guess right now in the entire world, there's 300 or 400 people who really understand how the algorithms and the design choices in systems like Facebook or TikTok work and what the consequences of them are. And maybe only 20 or 30 of those people still work at Facebook. Like a huge fraction of them have retired or have just gone on to other things because they burnt out. And that really scares me because places like Twitter that don't make as much money, they just don't get anyone, or they get 5 people, right? They run on little tiny shoestrings. And so we need to start talking about, if every year we graduated 10,000 people in the world or 100,000 people in the world or 1 million people in the world who had opinions about these things, who had enough intuition that they kind of understood what the trade-offs were, it would mean every person in Congress could have a legislative aide who could meaningfully coach them. Right now, even the legislative aides, even the policy people learn on the job. And the part that's scary about that is when I was about to come out on 60 Minutes, we were working with 2 Senate staffers, one for Marsha Blackburn, one for Blumenthal, to prep for the Senate hearing. And we'd given them a bunch of documents, and we asked them like, hey, like, should we give these documents to more staffers on the committee? And one of them looked at me and like paused and sighed, and they were like, you know, that would be great. And I would totally say yes if we could go 2 weeks without having a staffer leave for Facebook. Right. So even when we have some expertise in government, begin to understand how these things work, they get a job for 3 or 4 or 5 times as much money as I did as being a Senate staffer. And any world where we're relying on the companies to train the people who keep us safe in-house, where we require Congress people to train their aides in-house, is a world where we're not going to be safe. So we have to figure out how to do that together.
Very interesting. Thank you for
Yeah.
that, Francis. So I think we'll open it up to Q&A now. Sarah, if you want to take that away with the audience, please.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with a question from our online audience, and then we'll open it up to the room. This question is from Jonathan. He wrote, several suggestions for limiting the negative social impacts of social media require reducing the total amount of time users interact with them. How can these solutions be compelling for companies to enact when interaction is directly related to their revenue? Is it entirely up to regulators to enforce?
So this is one of the spaces where I think litigation is going to end up being a big thing, where particularly around mental health issues in kids, I think there's a lot of things where companies could meaningfully be reducing the harm. So it's things like meaningfully giving people tools to go to bed, or like a lot of kids with eating disorders, they'll say really explicitly, like I'm in therapy or I'm working with someone. I know this content is bad for me. I know when I do this, it's bad for me, but it follows me around Instagram. Like we don't give people the option right now to reset the model without losing all their content. Like we force people to choose between their past and their future. Think about that. I think we're going to move to a world where as there's more public context, like once you see the menu of options, we're going to start seeing a shift from saying, oh, you're liable because you showed that content, to saying, hey, you actually made a series of choices. You chose not to put a seatbelt in. You should be liable for that. I think the secondary thing is there probably will be some regulation at some point that gives people more choices. And the reality is every single other comparably powerful industry has some limits placed upon it. So it's closer towards the public good. And I think there's ways of doing that value freedom and autonomy. And we need to start having a conversation around how do we design for autonomy and dignity.
Questions from the room? We've got one over there.
Hi, my name is Juan Telles, and I'm an MBA full-time student here at Scheller. As Facebook and literally many, if not most of the tech companies and corporations move into the metaverse, literally adding one more dimension to all these complications, should we evolve into that? How do you see all these issues that you're talking about evolving to be more complex, more interpolated, etc.?
So in general, I always talk about social platforms. So all the work that we're doing, we're making sure to think about it in generalizable ways. So often when I talk with like regulators, I encourage people to take a step back and think about these social systems as abstractions. So for example, if you and I have a chat together, that's a one-on-one chat. If we have a group chat with like 5 people, that's a small n to small n chat. We have 5,000 people in a group, that's a large n to large n chat. Is that mediated with an algorithm? Is it mediated with just chronology? When you move into the metaverse, you get the exact same thing. So we can have coffee together in the metaverse. That's a one-on-one chat. We could have a dinner party in the metaverse. That's like have a beer in the metaverse. That's like a small n chat. You can have a concert. That's a one-to-many broadcast. And so as we move to the metaverse, we're gonna have some similar problems. So I think things like hate speech, other kinds of actions against marginalized populations are going to be a huge problem. Because we've already seen that. We have people following minorities around and whispering racial epithets in their ear, or groping women, that kind of thing. We're going to see those problems continue. But other problems like viral misinformation, I think we're going to see less of, because the only way information propagates in a virtual world is when people do transfer it to each other directly. There's less of the physics of like hypervirality that you see in something like Twitter and Facebook.
Hi.
Question.
In designing for dignity, might have a right to our data, but I'm curious how you think about having a right to the inferences that are drawn from that data and if they get protected by trade secrets.
Interesting. So I am a strong proponent of, we need to have more transparency on outcomes. So this is things like, we don't even have basic sampled data off of these platforms. I think for large scale platforms where you have things like Facebook as the internet, I think there should be transparency even on the algorithms themselves. The thing that gets hard on inferences is there's one thing where Facebook could publish, and you can do this today. You can ask for all of the data Facebook has on you because of GDPR. And you will get out some discrete labels, but there's a huge amount of inferences that are invisible in these middlemats, right? And I think that's like one of those things where I support people and the right to see what companies know about them. But as we get more and more dependent on opaque systems, we may not even know what they know because they don't even know what they know. They just know it does things.
Hey, Francis. Hey, Francis. I'm Michael Gill, a full-time student here at the MBA program. Could you just walk us through the thought process prior to 60 Minutes and prior to just kind of coming out and being the whistleblower?
So I joined Facebook. We'll go all the way back to the beginning. We'll try to do it fast. I joined Facebook in 2019 because I had a close friend. So I had to relearn to walk in my late 20s. So I got really sick. Turns out gluten is real. It's not just a hippie thing. And I ended up malnourished enough. I ended up in the hospital because I kept being told, oh, I would come in and say I'm in a lot of pain and I'm exhausted. And the doctors would be like, it sounds like you have depression. And in fact, I was starving to death. So slightly different things. But I had to relearn to walk. And I had a friend who was hired as an assistant and he became a very, very dear friend to me. And he would take me walking like 5 times a week. Like he was very, very patient with me and he was into weightlifting. So tell me about macros and things like that. And like, I credit that I am as healthy and have as robust life as I do today to this person. And in 2016, after Bernie Sanders lost, he fell into a very dark place on the internet. And I watched how much misinformation and conspiratorial thinking could change even like a smart, funny, college educated person, right? I was like, all of us are vulnerable. And I got offered this job to work on civic misinformation at Facebook. And I was like, oh, like this is going to be about like prepping for the 2020 election. Like, I'd love to do this. And I showed up. It was so much worse than I thought it was going to be. So I actually wasn't going to work on the US 2020 election. I was going to work on misinformation everywhere where there wasn't third-party fact checking. So go online. Facebook is very, very fleeting because they love to say things like, we have an international fact-checking program with over 80 partners, but they ignore to say how much money they spend on each of those partners. So back in 2020, 87% of their entire operational expenses for misinformation was spent on English, even though only 8 to 9% of users spoke English. So I show up and I'm like, they're like, you're gonna work on misinformation where we don't have third-party fact checking. And so I had thought I was a well-read person, and I was almost completely unaware of what was happening in African countries and Southeast Asia. And the thing that I was just blown away by was in the history of literacy, there have been only a few windows in time where like a society will go from being basically pre-literate, you know, a few percentage points people can read, to suddenly like a lot of people can read, like 30% can read. So like one of those was so printing press was not very disruptive because no one could read, right? It was like 60 years after the printing press that Martin Luther gets depression. His abbot's like, have you ever read the New Testament? He goes and reads the New Testament. He's like, oh my goodness, I'm not going to hell. Like all I have to do is be nice to people. And like, God has already forgiven me. And that like sounds crazy to us today because we're like, isn't that what Jesus said? Like that is Christianity. But medieval Christianity focused much, much more on like the Old Testament. And he's like, everyone must learn to read. right? Even the women must learn to read, right? And 20 years later, you had literacy rates in the Protestant parts of Germany be 10 times as high for women as they were in the Catholic parts. You went from being 3% literate to being 30% literate in like 20 years. And it meant for the first time, people started publishing pamphlets saying things like, did you know there are witches among you? You might have to burn your neighbor. You might have to, right? And so I was looking at this and I was like, oh my goodness, this is happening again. Right? Like in Myanmar, half of all the messages on Messenger were voice clips because people were becoming literate to use Facebook, right? And there are these people who had no context on history and had no context on like what the significance of what they're talking about. And I had not been familiar at all with like the communal violence aspect of social media in places that weren't the United States. So that was kind of set the stage. And because the consequences were so high, like I was willing to put up with a lot of unpleasant experiences for quite a long time, for like a year and a half. And then they got rid of the civic integrity team. And I have an MBA too, like many of you who are pursuing this room. And I took a class on change management. And change management says, hey, it's really hard for people to change as individuals. It's even harder for groups of people to change. If you want a company to go in a different direction, you have to appoint a vanguard. You have to say, this part of the company knows what they're doing. And the executives have to all like point at them all the time and be like, no. You can argue with them if you want to, but we're going that way. And Facebook did that for a long time. They did it all the way from right after the 2016 election, because like they got caught with all the Macedonian spammers, right? Like with their pants down. And all the way up till right after the 2020 election. And about a month after the 2020 election, they dissolved the civic integrity team. And the day that they did that, I was like, well, Facebook's doomed. Right? Like if they've clearly given up, they've clearly given faith that they can actually do this. And so I was working on counter-espionage at the time. And so I started so given I was hunting spies, I thought very hard about like how I would catch myself. And so it took me a long time to figure out how to do what I did. But that's kind of the pivotal moment where I decided I had to do something. Because the reality is sometimes we get stuck in loops. All of us do, right? We get stuck in loops and we cannot change without help from the outside. We need more support, we need insight. And I came to the conclusion Facebook could not save itself. The only way we could do it was by saving it together.
That's a good answer. I have another question from online. This is from Ben. He says, I'm a student heading towards PhD to try to work on social media systems, analyzing and improving their impact on our public culture and on individual experiences. I have the option of being more computationally oriented or more sociologically oriented. Which brand of expertise is valuable in our current social media environment? Any thought on how to find balance between the two?
Great question. So I think one of the things that we don't talk to college students enough about is that your life is very long and that you can be a very different person today than you will be in 10 years. And so I think sometimes one way to think about how to weigh some of these trade-offs is to come in and say, there may be choices I have to make in the short term. Like I might have to take a few more computational classes if I want to be able to get in the door at a social media company. But I am committing to, looking at the reading list for a class I may have had to trade off, or like committing to be a lifelong learner, committing to watching lectures on YouTube. Because like I am a very different person today than I was even 5 years ago. I'm an even more different person than I was 10 years ago. And that I think the real question is, are you going to make a commitment in investing in learning about the world? And my father is an MD PhD, so he is a doctor. I am the least educated person in my core family because I'm the one who didn't get a PhD, and they'll never let me forget about it. But
not yet.
yes, not yet. Thank you. Right attitude.
We have a PhD program here.
My grandmother got a law degree at 55. And my mother became a priest at 55. So
Amazing.
I could get a PhD for making a commitment to being a lifelong learner, I think is really, really important because let me finish. So he's an MD PhD and he took CS classes at Berkeley in the 60s. So Berkeley in the 60s. So I really love the history of computing. I think it's amazing. So back in the 60s, you had to do punch cards, right? Like there was like mainframes. And if you wanted to run your program, you thought very, very carefully about your very simple program, and you like made your little punch cards, and then you took it to the mainframe and they ran it for you and gave you X output. And if you did it during the day, it might take 2 or 3 hours for them to get to your stack of punch cards. And if you have a little bug, now it's gonna take like another 3 hours for you to fix it, right? But if you went there at 2 a.m, they'd run it immediately. So you just sit there and run it and like get your bug back, run it. And he really loved it. He loved programming, except for the people who were good at it, people who were like actually CS majors at Berkeley in the 60s, they lived in the mainframe room, right? Like they were there all night when they could run their programs over and again. And a couple of them had fleas. And he was like, this is not a lifestyle choice I can make. And but he still programs. Like when I was a kid, he digitized all the testing manual for like the University of Iowa. So they used to print like a paper little book of tests that you could get from the lab. It was immediately out of date. And like one of his big programs was he wrote a thing in Perl back in the day, a very basic website, and brought it online. And he used to always say, the best programmers are and people. So you can be just a programmer, but if you're a programmer and an artist, a programmer and a scientist, a programmer and a journalist, you're just a really interesting person. Like there's a lot of cool stuff you can do. And the reality is you guys are gonna have to make trade-offs in like what you take in school. But you are not done, right? You can continue to grow and change. And I think spending a little time thinking about who do you want to be? Who do you want to grow towards? And realizing that your journey will not be over when you graduate. It will just be beginning.
Thank you.
All right, we have time for one more question, and it's going to be from online. Sorry, guys. But the good news is that we will have a reception outside in the foyer afterwards with free lunch. So feel free to bring your questions out there to continue the discussion. But our final question for in here is from an anonymous person who said, what power structure do you think will manage social platforms in the future? Will we always have private companies managing our primary platforms? Any thoughts on public or civically managed social platforms?
Oh, that is a great question. So I feel pretty confident. So this might be because I live in Puerto Rico and we live in like a little crypto bubble. And we believe distributed is the future. But I strongly think there will be a decentralized end-to-end encrypted social network, personal social media. So I like to say there's broadcast social media, which is like TikTok. You know, people cross-post from TikTok to Instagram to YouTube. So they just want more impressions. They don't really care who sees it. Personal social media is kind of like email. Like you don't send an email because you want someone to read your email. Send your email because you want your professor to read your email. On personal social media, you don't post pictures of your birthday party or your baby because you want someone to see it. You post it because you want your grandma to see it, because you want your friends to see it. I've learned I can't tell this joke as well in colleges because you guys actually don't remember. I usually am like, hey, do you remember Facebook of 2008? It was amazing. And everyone's like, I was like, oh yeah. Facebook of 2008 was about your family and your friends, right? Like it was your family and your friends. Like, and then when you stop a random person on the street or you stop a millennial, let's be honest here, and you're like, what is Facebook? They'll say it's about my family and my friends. But the reality is that hasn't been true for a really long time, right? Every quarter, Facebook had to get you to look at a little bit more content. And so they kept making more and more compromises. They kept figuring out ways to fill your feed up so you'd have a longer and longer session, even if it was a less meaningful or less enjoyable session, maybe less happy, because they had to get the profit. And I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a social network that is funded by a coin, that has a DAO that does major management decisions, where you own your data, where you're compensated for it. I think that's going to happen eventually. And that's actually part of why I want to do a simulated social network. Because in that social network, you're not going to be able to look at the content, understand the consequences. You're going to have to think about it and talk about it and potentially simulate it in order to have safety.
All right, surprise, we have one more question.
Sure.
Thank you. We have 7 more minutes. So we have someone in the back that's been waiting for a while that we didn't see. So sorry about that. Go ahead.
You said this question has been answered.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, we'll fit one more in from over here.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks very much again for coming to Georgia Tech today. I'm very curious what you would say to the individual, say, data science practitioner who is still at Facebook and has the same thoughts that you do. I obviously think that whistleblowing, is one very valid option. But something I hear a lot is like, oh, do you stay within the company and try and change it, or do you leave and try and like affect it from the outside? And so I'm curious, yeah, like what would you say, should all of the data scientists walk away from Facebook, or should they try and change it from inside?
So I get asked a question a lot, which is, I have an internship offer with Facebook, or I have a fresh grad offer with Facebook. Should I go there? I get asked that question a lot. And I think it's kind of like the parallel question to that question. The thing I always say is, I strongly encourage people to work at Meta. I strongly encourage people to work at all these big companies, because we are living in an era where the most important parts of our company, our economy, are run by opaque systems. It used to be if you made a car, we knew where the factory was. It took tens of thousands of workers who weren't actually that attached. They tell you lots of stuff about what's going on. You could measure the pollution that came out of the factory. You could measure the water. You could take the car apart. These systems run our lives now, and they're entirely hidden. And like I was saying before, like, because people are trained from within, we can't build that external public muscle of accountability because we don't even know what's going on. One of the most important things you can do is to go in there and have your eyes open. And the secondary thing is, Facebook is an incredibly poorly managed company. Like, you can go in there and basically do whatever you want for probably a year or a year and a half before you get fired. And I like to be very open about this because I know it annoys them. So Facebook has a belief in flatness, like the idea that you could be managed by metrics, right? That like they literally have an open floor plan office, a quarter of a mile long. It's 5,000 people. It's an aircraft hangar. It's very uncomfortable, but it's flat, right? Everyone's equal. And they have this idea that, as long as you make the metrics go up, then you're good. But if the metrics don't go up, did you do a bad job? Like, it's very hard for them to figure out, did you actually do a bad job just because the metrics didn't go up? And what I say to people is, like, I think it's really important to ask the question of, you get paid so much more at Facebook than you do even at Google. You get paid so much more at Google than you get at most places. But if you go to Facebook and say, for the first time in my life, I'm going to try to get meets expectations. Like, I'm not going to try to get exceeds expectations or greatly exceeds expectations. I am not going on the validation treadmill. I'm just going to do I'm going to do what's required. I'm going to take that extra time, that extra effort I would have spent trying to get exceeds expectations, and I'm going to go help the hate speech team. Because if I give them 4 hours a week, it actually meaningfully changes what they can accomplish. If I give them 10 hours a week, it meaningfully changes what they can accomplish. And the reality is, Facebook is so desperate for people, they will be thrilled that you work hard for 35 hours a week or 40 hours a week. Right? Good, you pushed the ball down the line, you didn't quit. Sure, go spend 10 hours on hate speech. And so I think that's the thing I always try to remind people is, you have agency. Like, you can make real choices, you can make a real difference. And even if all you do is go into those companies and keep your eyes open and you ask questions, if you come out and you even are a quiet whistleblower, for every visible whistleblower, there are 1,000 people who are quiet whistleblowers. They talk to their professors and give details. They tell Congress, but they never come out publicly. They tell the FCC. They tell a journalist. You are a vital part of the information immune system of our democracy. And if good people don't go to these companies, we will not have that immune system.
Yeah, Francis, of all the salary and job negotiation techniques I've read, I've never heard one about, well, I could just go to work at Facebook and do the minimum and blend in for a year. So why should I work so hard for you?
You probably will make more getting meets expectations at Facebook than you would get getting exceeds expectations at Google. So I had a friend go and interview across Silicon Valley. So he's like a mid-level person. So it's not going to be as good as it is for like fresh grads. But he went and intentionally got a bunch of job offers at the same time. The thing people do, people will book 2 weeks of vacation and go and do all their interviews in one lump so they can all play their offers off each other. And he went and got some large number, like 8 offers, 10 offers. And he ended up going to Facebook because it was 30% higher than his next highest offer. That is what brand liability does to a corporation. And so remember, you can go to Meta and remember you are still a person. You are not just an employee number. You're still a citizen. You're not just, someone getting a paycheck. So that's a reminder.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Francis. Everyone, please